Let's talk exposure. Let's talk exposure triangle. Aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Three things that you need to know to level up your photography and take it to the next place. Hey, my name is Ryan. I'm a photographer based in New York City. Welcome to the channel. In today's video, I want to cover something that's fundamental to photography, but that was so confusing to me when I first got started. So I hope that this is a straightforward, simple, and easy way to learn the fundamentals of the exposure triangle. Now, with iPhones and priority modes in our cameras today, it's really easy to skip over learning the exposure triangle, early on in our photography journeys. But it is really important to learn the three components of the triangle so that you can start to stylistically and artistically manipulate your images to make them look exactly the way that you want them to. And it's really easy, so I'm going to walk you through it today. So first, there are three parts of the exposure triangle: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. And you can think of your camera like an eye. It's just an eye. And your eye has different parts within it that help you to see and interpret light. Your camera does exactly the same thing using the three pieces of the exposure triangle: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. The way that they interact with each other, they complement each other. The way that that happens and the way that the light ultimately hits that sensor or that piece of film is basically the way that your eye would be seeing the world. It's just the technical version of that. So let's start with aperture. Aperture is a great place to start when we start to think about the components of the exposure triangle. Now, the aperture is part of your lens, and the aperture is literally how large the hole inside the lens is to let light pass through it. So you can see here in this lens that the aperture here is nice and wide open, so lots of light would pass through it, or as I close it down, less light would pass through it. That's the aperture. It's literally how open or closed, or how wide or narrow the space within your lens is that the light then passes through to go into the camera. You can think of the aperture like the pupil of your eye. So do you remember back when you were in science class as a kid and you would look in the mirror and they would turn the lights on and the lights off and you'd see your pupil dilate or contract? That is essentially what the aperture does. That is the way that we use the aperture in our camera. Your pupils got bigger when it was dark so they could let more light into your eyes. We do the same thing with aperture. We open the aperture when we have less light available in a scene so that more of what is available can come into the camera. An aperture is expressed as an F number or an F stop. And this stop refers to a stop of light, which is a mathematical computation that I don't understand. I just know what the numbers stand for and how I use them in my photography. So forget about what a stop is for the moment and just know that aperture is expressed as an F value. But all you need to remember is that those low f-stop numbers mean that the lens is more wide open. So the lower the number, the wider the aperture of the lens, the more light that can pass through it. The larger the number, the smaller the hole, or the smaller the aperture that the light can pass through to hit the digital sensor. It's really that simple. And you will learn this with memorization, and you'll learn it over time, but for now, all you need to know is that those low numbers, the 1.2s, the 1.4s, the 1.8s, even the 2.8s, they just mean that the lens is able to open up further and let more light in. Now, the aperture actually has two primary purposes. The first is functional, which we just talked about, which is literally how much light is it going to let into the body of the camera to hit that digital sensor or that strip of film if you're working on film. But it also has stylistic implications. We use aperture to create different stylistic versions of photos. Aperture controls what we call depth of field, or literally how much of the image is in focus from front to back. Now, the wider open that the aperture is, the less of the image is going to be in focus. And you've probably seen this in portraits in particular, where you can see the subject's face or the subject's body, but the rest of the photo is kind of creamy and blurred out. We call this bokeh, and the aperture is the thing that controls this. So in portrait work, for example, when we use a wider open aperture, we are letting more light in, yes, but we are also letting less of the image be in focus. So in portraits, what this looks like is that creamy background. Now, in something like landscape photography or street photography, typically we want more of the image to be in focus. We want that sense of place. We want the environment and the context of the image. So we shut that aperture down a bit, and that allows more of the image to be in focus. So the depth of field is controlled by aperture. The smaller f-stop, or the wider the aperture, the less of the image is going to be in focus, or the shallower the depth of field. The more closed down the aperture is, or the higher that f-stop number, the more of the image is going to be in focus, or the deeper the depth of field. So remember when I said at the beginning that these three things work together, that they supplement each other. They're in a relationship with each other. It's almost like a little photography love triangle. And when you adjust the aperture in one direction, you also need to adjust the shutter, or the ISO, in a different direction. And what this does, this relationship between the three sides of the triangle, is it allows us to maintain a consistent exposure in the image. Now, you may have heard lenses referred to as being fast lenses. What that means is lenses that have a wider open aperture, so the 1.2s, the 1.4s, the 1.8s, they are called fast lenses because when the lens is all the way wide open, a lot of light is coming into the camera sensor. And that means that the shutter needs to move faster and therefore let in less light in order to maintain a balanced exposure. So these lenses that can go to 1.2, 1.4, 1.8, 2.8 are considered to be fast lenses because the relationship between the aperture and the shutter is such that when you use those wide open apertures, like that, you need a faster shutter, which brings us to shutter speed. Shutter speed is the second part of the exposure triangle, and shutter speed controls literally how fast the shutter of the camera is going to open and close to let the light through. The light that's coming in from the lens through this aperture into the body of the camera also has a shutter behind it that's going to open and close and determine how fast that light is going to be able to move through the camera. If we go back to the eye analogy, the shutter is like your eyelid, the speed at which you can blink, a slow blink or a fast blink. Shutter speed is exactly the same thing. It's expressed as a fraction, usually, and this fraction basically means the fraction of a second that the shutter is going to open and then close. So the smaller that fraction, 1/1000th of a second, means that the shutter is literally going to only be open for 1/1000th of a second. So pretty fast. Cameras these days go up to 1/4000th of a second, and even faster than that in some cases. So when you have a wide aperture, often you need a fast shutter speed in order to maintain an even exposure. You can also use a slow shutter speed. So 1/30th of a second, 1/60th of a second. So if a 1/1000th of a second shutter moves like this, a 1/30th of a second shutter might move like this. And you can see that the amount of light that would come through the aperture into the camera with a fast versus a slow shutter is going to be really different. And what this does not only allows us to maintain correct exposure, but it also has stylistic implications. So just like aperture had both a functional and a stylistic use, shutter speed does the same thing. Now, stylistically, shutter speed helps us with what we call motion blur. And I actually just published a video on this last week or the week before, and I'll link it in the video, but it was all about how to use shutter speed to create a motion within your photo. And the way that I talk about this, and be sure to check that video out, is by introducing motion blur. The slower the shutter moves, the more that you are going to see things within it move. You're going to capture that sense of motion. When you have a really fast shutter speed that opens and closes really fast, the amount of light that goes through there is just that quick second. And it basically freezes in space and time whatever the subject is. So it looks like it's literally frozen. If you see things jumping or running or driving, they don't look as like they're in motion, they look like they're frozen. Whereas if you use a slower shutter speed, 1/15th of a second, 1/30th of a second, 1/60th of a second, or even a full second, what happens is that as that shutter opens and closes, the motion of the subjects is going to be captured because that light is all hitting the sensor, and it creates motion blur effects. It allows you to pan through the image or create light trails or soften your focus and create a slight sense of blur. There's a lot you can do stylistically with shutter, and that is just one of the functions of shutter speed. So aperture and shutter are really the two primary ways that most photographers use to stylistically interpret their photos. But there is a third piece of the exposure triangle, and that's ISO. Now, if you've ever shot film before, you used to work on film, you know that you used to have to buy film strips with a certain ISO. You'd buy ISO 100 film or ISO 200 film that you would use during the daylight, and then you would buy ISO 800 film, for example, or ISO 3200 film for use at night. The ISO number on film and on digital cameras basically just refers to how sensitive the sensor or the film strip is going to be to light. So the lower that number, that 100 or 200 ISO value, means that it is less sensitive to light. We use this in bright situations where we don't need more sensitivity to light. We have abundant light. We're outside. We've got some sort of a studio light that we are lighting for our photos. So during the day or in those brightly lit scenes, we can use that lower ISO and not have to worry as much about exposure. However, when we don't have a lot of light in the scene, we can essentially add light via the ISO. By increasing the sensitivity of either the film that's in the camera or the digital sensor, we are adding light back into the scene. Now you might ask, why wouldn't I always just use ISO 3200 or film that is 3200 grade? And the reason is that as we increase the sensitivity of the sensor or the film to light, we have to do that by using larger particles or pixels in order to capture that light. So on film, that means you get more pronounced film grain, and digitally, that means that you get what's called noise. And this is essentially basically when we have lots of pixels that have to start to be used to recruit enough light to form the image. So the images are less sharp, they've got more texture, and the noise is introduced to the image. So we try and use an ISO that we set at the beginning of a shoot or at the beginning of a scene because we know generally what the light is going to look like. If it's a bright day outside, we use ISO 100 or 200 or even 400. I use ISO 400 with most of my outdoor work. If we don't have a lot of light or we're shooting at night or we're shooting a dimly lit scene, we need to increase that ISO. Now I will say that most digital cameras these days, especially the higher end ones, can shoot at really high ISOs and the amount of noise is really minimal. They're extremely, extremely capable, and there's also noise reduction software out there that helps you sort of smooth out the image. But we do choose our ISO typically at the beginning of a shoot and the beginning of a setting, and then from there, the only things that we're thinking about are the relationship between the aperture and the shutter speed. Now, if we're using the eye analogy for ISO, I think about ISO as almost the relationship between the eye and the brain. It's the brain interpreting what's coming into the light and telling it what it's seeing. So let's put it together. There are three pieces of the exposure triangle: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. They are in a relationship with each other. If you increase the aperture, then you need to make an adjustment to your shutter speed to maintain that same level of exposure. But you can use aperture and shutter speed for stylistic purposes to achieve motion blur or add bokeh to your images to blur out the background and isolate your subjects. So that's it for me, the basics of the exposure triangle: aperture, shutter speed, ISO. I hope that you found that this video was educational, you learned something, that it was easy to understand. Let me know what you thought. Leave me a comment below. Shoot me a DM on Instagram. And importantly, also please like the video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps out and I really appreciate you watching. See you in the next video.